So, a brief introduction to Speaking Human. I'll start off with a tongue twister, and wherever you are, just try and say it out loud a few times to yourself, and try and say it fast. And wonder at what makes it so difficult for us to say, why we stumble over the words. Around the rugged rock, the ragged rascal ran. Not easy, obviously, and growing up, this sentence caused me a considerable amount of pain, even just to say it once and say it slowly. And so did this one. She sells seashells by the seashore. I would practice saying these tongue twisters over and over again because I had a speech impediment, and a pretty bad one at that. I couldn't pronounce the letters R or S, two of the most commonly used consonants in the English language, and in a cruel twist of fate, two of the most commonly used consonants in my name and hometown. Massachusetts being tied only with Mississippi for the most S's in its state name. So every R became a W, W, and every S became a TH, th. I won't replicate what it sounded like to say my own name out loud, but you can imagine. So as a kid, I became very aware of my own voice and how my sound warped my sense of self and the way that other people perceived me. Despite getting older, I still sounded childish, and despite a growing vocabulary, I still sounded simple. It didn't matter what I was saying, all the attention went to how I said it, and I learned that my choice of words would either help or hurt my ability to communicate effectively. For example, when I was frustrated, it wasn't easy to just say so because I would brace for the impact of saying the word itself, frustrated. Or when I was sorry, it was hard to sound sincere because I would scramble for any other word that wasn't so challenging to say. And because of this, everything seemed heightened emotionally, so when I would dramatically shift my tone in response to how I was feeling, it would inevitably just make people chuckle because I would turn into this sort of dramatized cartoon character or a caricature of someone else. And I was in good company, you could say then, with Tweety Bird and Daffy Duck and Elmer Fudd, who all struggled with speech impediments like mine. But it got old, and I got older, and yet I still sounded cute. My words were so watered down, devoid of clarity or emphasis. And in the process of figuring out how to find my own voice, I came to take words very seriously. And the written word especially, because it provided me a safe space for self-expression. The substance of what I was saying mattered more for the first time, and I could finally control how I said it. I could create a voice on the page and vary my tone depending on who I was writing for or what I was writing about or how I was just feeling in the moment. I figured out that a single word can be said in so many different ways, with so many different meanings. It just depends on who says it and how, because a voice is as unique as a fingerprint. And with that, I came to kind of understand these concepts of voice and tone. Voice is constant. It's at the heart of who you are. It's your personality, your sense of purpose, and the perspective through which you see the world. Voice is about understanding yourself, knowing who you are, how you speak, and why. So your style of speaking or writing, your rhythm and texture, that's your voice. For example, rhetorical devices like alliteration, when consecutive words start with the same letter and make the same sound. For example, personality, purpose, perspective. There's rhythm that comes from the repetition of the series. It starts to find a beat. And a texture that forms from the pitter-patter of the P. It works so well when we're reading because the pattern emphasizes what it sounds like to say the word out loud, and all of a sudden it's as if the words we're reading are speaking and we can hear them. Tone, on the other hand, shifts largely based on who you're speaking to or who you're writing for. It's about temperament, how you're both feeling. It's about timing or the situation that you find yourself. And it's about relationship, how much trust you have. Tone is about understanding your audience, finding the right words for the moment, knowing when to speak and maybe when to stay quiet. And if you're writing a love letter, for example, and an apology to different people, very likely you're going to express love and compassion and understanding in both, but in drastically different ways. You take your voice and you apply it to the moment differently. That's your tonality. So in speech therapy, I learned how important these concepts are in child development. Our voice is one of the earliest ways we learn to recognize and differentiate each other. It's how we make a first impression and establish connections. And we're exposed to these characters and cartoons as kids in which the tonality of each is exaggerated beyond that of the average human because it enables us to learn how to pick up on social cues and emotional triggers and generally how to communicate person to person. So now is when I've revealed myself as a proud word nerd. And what fascinates me is that we're not the only ones doing this. The human voice, which grants us agency and identity, we lend to non-human entities all the time, and we've been doing it for decades. Now, this may be the time in which I pull out my tin hat and go down some extraterrestrial conspiracy theory, but in fact, I'm not thinking about aliens, I'm more thinking about fruit. Apple's voice is that guy in college who kind of knew he was smarter than everyone else, and everyone else kind of knew he was smarter than them, but he was also on the swimming team, so the combination of his smart brains and svelte torso made him popular, which in turn made him a bit smug and inaccessible. Simply put, Apple is clever but not nerdy. They see themselves as drastically different from their competitors, from which they derive a sense of superiority and status, but they're also secretly looking for approval. So they try and make jokes or turn a phrase that can come off as sassy or sarcastic, like in the case of the 2000 advertisement, or trying too hard in other cases. For example, even last week, when they announced Apple One, their new bundled app service, and with it they launched this line of copy into the world: the biggest bang, binge, and blast for your buck. They're clearly trying to sound fun and punchy and relatable, mimicking the tonality of their worldwide developer conference presentations, which I would otherwise characterize as professionally pumped up. But ultimately this just falls flat and far from human, because alliteration can be great to make it sound as if someone is speaking words aloud to you, but there's just too many sounds in this sentence for it to actually be conversational. Think of the tongue twisters back in the beginning, an endless series of similar sounds that we would never actually use to construct a sentence. In this case, there's just too many B's, and on top of that, then there's all the G's, and all making different sounds one after the other. So we have biggest, bang, and binge. It's first G, and then and lastly J. And these sounds just kind of get caught up in your mouth in a way that doesn't sound casual. So I warned you, I'm a word nerd. Maybe we take a look at another example. Nike's voice, for example, is the ultimate coach for whom there is a moral to every story, and who talks about what it takes to win as much as she talks about what it takes to not lose. Nike looks for a fight because the struggle builds character, and character lasts longer than any numbers on a scoreboard. Their voice is intense, it's independent, and it's prone to storytelling. Their style is crisp and clean, unlike some of their competitors who venture more into an artistic expression in the context of sport, leaning more towards creativity as opposed to clarity. And for Nike, every word focuses on the human, not the game. And if these brands sound like caricatures, it's because that's what they're based on. The 12 brand archetypes, loosely drawn from the work of the psychologist Carl Jung in the 20th century, who developed these archetypes, well, not these ones, but his own, as a way to distill down to the most simple elements that which forms our humanness. And I'm reading from Wikipedia directly now, but they say the idea behind using brand archetypes in marketing is to anchor the brand against an icon already embedded within the conscience and subconscious of humanity. In other words, trying to mimic that which feels familiar to our very being. And for decades, brands used these archetypes to manufacture an identity in an effort to play human and be liked by other humans. So Apple was the creator, and Nike the hero, and Harley-Davidson the rebel. But how far can a rebel voice go? The same as we learn in child development, brands leverage their voice and tone to be recognized and differentiate from each other, to make a first impression and to create connections. But what about when you receive a chat reply from customer support, or an email notifying you of a data privacy breach? How does the rebel voice meet the moment? When brand archetypes were all the rage, the reality was our interactions with brands were limited. We would talk on occasion, but not all the time. I liken it a bit to the early days of dating someone in which you see them every so often, and every time you see them, they look their best, they sound their best, and ultimately come across as their best selves. And so brands with archetypes could play into the extreme and play into the caricature because we weren't seeing them all that often. In essence, our relationship with brands was in person, it was focused on buying the product, and it was a one-off interaction. But since this, circa 2005, 2007, and software eating the world, it's all about digitalization, servicification, and customer experience. We've gone from the occasional night out with brands to living with each other. We see them all day, every day, and they're talking to us all the time. In search and display ads, out of home and in store, at sign up and onboarding, in error messages and push notifications, in transactional emails and editorial newsletters, on the web with feature comparisons and pricing, mission statements and manifestos, dynamic pages based on wherever else you're coming from on the internet, in the App Store with release notes across a slew of social media, and in customer chat integrated across every digital interface in which they're talking to someone who's pretending to play a brand for a day, any kind of brand of human. It's exhausting to say all of this in a single breath, as it is to think of all of the words brands are saying to us in a single day. And with such an influx of interactions, brands burrow deeper into the nuances of human language, emotion, and communication. And whereas they used to be all about the archetype, just like when I was struggling with my speech impediment and would end up talking like a fictional cartoon character, more and more brands are trying to avoid that caricature and trying to sound more authentic. For example, in the search category, look at a company called Hims. It's a telehealth company focused on men's wellness, offering generic brand medication for everything from hair loss to erectile dysfunction and all direct to consumer. So the experience of trying to search for these problems and buy these keywords can be intimidating and overwhelming. So how does a brand express empathy and understanding and express a dynamic enough personality in which it sounds like you're talking to someone you can trust, not just a singularly defined archetype? To begin with, there's the headline, alliteration in this case, another example, but one that works really well. Again, it creates a sense of rhythm, but in this case, the alliteration also creates a sense of steadiness, and the repetition can be found calming, particularly with the soft H sound. There's the reliability of the punctuation, the fact that every individual word in the headline ends with a period. It feels definitive, it feels stable. Everything is in lower cases, making it sound casual and friendly and approachable, not unlike how you would text a friend for help or advice on something. And lastly, they don't spell out erectile dysfunction because it's an unnecessary reminder. But they do place the acronym at the end of the sentence, and because it's the only thing in all caps, it's one of the first things you see. So it's like Hims is giving us a wink and a nod. They're saying, we know why you're here, there's no need to spell it out, and we got you covered. And this is only one example of how Hims speaks, but it varies across the customer life cycle, eschewing the limitations of traditional brand archetypes. And the fact that it begins in a search context and that they're thinking about what that first impression is like, it tells you a little something about what the customer journey looks like beyond that and how the brand becomes more dynamic and robust the deeper you get in. If we look at another example, Headspace, the meditation app. Here's a few scenes from their onboarding process and app, and from the left, they refer to you by name to start out with, demonstrating they know you in some way and feel more familiar with you. They establish trust and professionalism by setting expectations so you feel in control. And if you're thinking that this is all part of UX design, it absolutely is, but it's also verbal design, thinking about what to say, when, and how, the kind of relationship you want to build with the person on the other side of you. In the center, when asking why you're here, they use active verbs like being and finding, as opposed to a commanding tone with be better or find calm. It makes it sound like something you're already working on, and they're just one resource to support your journey. And lastly, they recap, demonstrating attentiveness that they've been listening to you. All of this comes together to create a relationship and build trust and something that people can relate to, not unlike others in their life. And perhaps the best example, in this case it's an error message, but it's one of the best examples of a brand not just sounding human, but straight up just being human. This is an error message from Slack, and if we think of error messages, they happen obviously at a critical juncture, when something went wrong, the brand needs to acknowledge it, take responsibility, and then fix it, whatever the it might be. And the user can feel frustrated or confused, and there's a scale of human emotion that we might be experiencing, so we need to meet that moment. This is an example from the early days of Slack, written by their founder, and I think it's actually since been retired, hopefully because they fixed the problem itself. But it says, "Apologies, we're having some trouble with your WebSocket connection. We've seen this problem clear up with a restart of Slack, a solution which we suggest to you now only with great regret and self-loathing." Regret and self-loathing, two of the most quintessential human emotions. And we chuckle at this, and we like it, and we share it because we get it, we can relate to it. Slack makes you feel like there are a bunch of people sitting on one end of a computer, writing out what's on their mind and what's happening to you, the person sitting on the other end of the computer, who's just trying to get on with their WebSocket connection and general human existence. And this isn't to say that every brand has to sound as human or as casual or conversational or direct as Slack. There's obviously a spectrum to be followed, especially when it comes to the interface or the moment that you're finding yourself in writing. Onboarding being very different from an error message, being very different from a receipt that you receive in your inbox. But there is something here in the honesty of it. And we've seen this evolution of brands in the three that we've looked at, but over time as well, in how they manage to be conversational and how they manage to not just be talking at you, but really talking with you. And that's a brief introduction to how to speak human. It starts with our own lived experiences, that which makes us vulnerable and human, which sometimes makes us feel like outsiders and aliens. We then try and bottle and brand those sounds and sentiments, burrowing so deep into the moments of everyday life that we start to believe it's real and end up saying that a fruit sounds smug. But my real point in all of this is what I imagine we all thought of when I first said we're not the only ones doing this. It wasn't Apple we thought of, it was AI. Because we're really just at the beginning of this new era in which what it means to speak human isn't about being human at all anymore. Not when GPT-30 can generate text in human voice, even replicating the style of individual journalists or public figures. Not when we're replacing complete sentences chock full of passion or disbelief with emoji because technology taught us to. And as we dive deeper into the world of conversational AI and become increasingly comfortable with voice assistants, how we speak human will continue to evolve. It already is if we look at kids today and how they talk with their Alexa, with a commanding tone, not even speaking in full sentences. It's just the imperative, and there's no real expression of human emotion, no shift in tonality. It's the same monotone cadence of speaking and how we ask for things and how we reply to things. And as we continue to embrace AI and voice as a new form of communication, it's not just us informing that technology, it's that technology obviously coming back to us. And I think we should look at the evolution of brand communications, of verbal design and verbal identity, and seeing it, drawing from that inspiration from how brands have over time finessed what it means to sound human and be conversational, and take that with us as we develop these relationships with technology in a much deeper sense. Because one of the biggest differences in how we approach AI and voice is that we're comfortable, we're actually embracing the fact that it's not human, and we're looking to keep it that way to some extent. Whereas with brands, we've developed this kind of hybrid relationship. We know it's hundreds of humans behind the brand, but AI, even if it's humans initially investing in building it, it eventually takes on a voice of its own. And what that looks like and what that sounds like and how we talk with it is going to be very different. So I hope you find this of interest. It's certainly an area of curiosity and passion for me, and something that with no sense of finality I continue to explore. But please feel free to share feedback or ideas as you reflect on this and have kind of other ideas come to mind. But thanks so much for listening.